In early 1942, while the Pacific War was still young, senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered not for combat, but for calculation. They assembled in a controlled, almost ceremonial space, where the noise of engines and the uncertainty of weather were replaced by felt-covered tables and measured voices. This was a war game, an intellectual exercise meant to confirm what many already believed, that Japan had seized the initiative and the future now followed a predictable course. Miniature ships slid across the map with careful precision. Each carrier, each cruiser, each destroyer stood in for a real vessel, already at sea or soon to sail, carrying crews who would never know their fate was being debated in abstraction. The table reduced oceans to inches and lives to symbols. Here, outcomes could be paused, rewound, and reconsidered. It was order imposed on chaos. But the exercise was never intended to ask dangerous questions. Its purpose was reassurance. Victory was not merely hoped for, it was expected. The rules, the assumptions, and the sequence of play all leaned gently toward success. The future was something to be confirmed, not challenged. Quietly, almost apologetically, young umpires recorded the results as they unfolded, and what they saw unsettled them. An American carrier force appeared where doctrine said it should not be. Movements on the table suggested initiative, speed, and coordination that contradicted accepted beliefs. On paper, Japanese losses began to accumulate with uncomfortable speed. The room grew tense, not with fear, but with irritation. The numbers did not feel right. The results did not align with experience, hierarchy, or confidence. The dice, small, ordinary objects meant to introduce chance, were rolled. Then, rolled again, and again. Each time, the outcome shifted slightly, nudged closer to expectation. Eventually, the figures stabilized. The future was corrected. The war game ended with a result that felt acceptable, even reassuring. The officers left believing the exercise had confirmed their superiority. What they did not confront was the quiet truth recorded before the dice were adjusted, one that would soon move from the map table to the open sea. The naval culture that shaped the Imperial Japanese Navy had been forged in certainty. For decades, officers were trained to believe that war could be mastered through discipline, meticulous planning, and adherence to doctrine. Improvisation was admired only after victory, never before it. Chance was acknowledged in theory, but distrusted in practice. A good plan, they believed, did not rely on luck. Within this mindset, war games served a specific function. They were not laboratories for uncomfortable discovery, but rituals of confirmation. Their purpose was to validate assumptions already approved by rank and tradition. When results aligned with expectation, they were praised as proof of intellectual rigor. When they did not, the problem was assumed to lie not with the assumptions, but with the game itself. An unfavorable outcome was more than a tactical concern. It carried a moral implication. To accept it openly suggested flawed reasoning, insufficient faith in doctrine, or worse, a lack of loyalty. In such an environment, intellectual disagreement was easily mistaken for defiance. Probability, therefore, was permitted only within carefully defined boundaries. Randomness was acceptable so long as it did not challenge hierarchy. The umpires at the table understood this instinctively. Most were junior officers, trained to observe and record, but also to survive within the institution. They saw what the figures suggested. They saw how quickly theoretical losses accumulated when the enemy was allowed initiative. And they understood, just as clearly, the risk of insisting on those numbers. Corrections were subtle. A die roll adjusted here, an assumption clarified there. No single change appeared dishonest in isolation. Each alteration was framed as refinement, balance, or realism. But taken together, they reshaped the outcome into something more palatable. Reality was not denied outright, it was edited, trimmed to fit the emotional requirements of command. When the exercise concluded, victory was declared. The paperwork reflected confidence. The atmosphere relaxed. The institution remained intact, its harmony preserved. On paper, the future looked secure. What remained unspoken was the cost of that harmony, and how soon the unedited version of reality would demand to be faced. Across the map table, the enemy existed only as symbols and ratios. American industrial capacity vast, flexible, and still awakening was compressed into neat figures on a chart. Shipyards became numbers. Factories became timelines. The human effort behind them disappeared entirely. In this reduced form, the United States looked manageable, even slow, bound by distance and bureaucracy. American pilots were judged through the same lens. They were assumed inferior in training, inferior in spirit, and overly dependent on rigid procedures. Japanese naval aviation, hardened in China and refined through constant drills, was taken as inherently superior. Skill was treated as a fixed national trait, not a variable shaped by experience, failure, and adaptation. Command behavior, too, was expected to follow predictable lines. American admirals, it was believed, would react cautiously and conventionally. They would advance only when compelled, retreat when threatened, and follow doctrine rather than intuition. The enemy was modeled as a stable equation, not a thinking opponent. Surprise, meanwhile, was treated as an exhausted resource. The attack on Pearl Harbor was seen as a singular shock, decisive, unrepeatable, and psychologically final. Having delivered it once, Japan assumed the strategic initiative would remain permanently tilted in its favor. The idea that surprise could be regained, or reversed, was largely dismissed. Most critically, the possibility of American learning was excluded altogether. Adaptation was not factored in. Mistakes were assumed to compound, not correct. Losses were expected to discourage rather than instruct. In the logic of the game, the enemy remained static while Japan advanced along a predetermined path. As a result, numbers began to replace judgment. Probabilities replaced curiosity. Human adaptability, messy, unpredictable, and dangerous to assume away, was filtered out in favor of clean projections. The enemy was no longer a living force, but a mathematical problem already solved. When the game concluded, confidence followed naturally. The calculations aligned. The assumptions reinforced one another. The future appeared orderly, even generous. There was little left to debate. What no one at the table confronted was the simplest variable of all, that the enemy was watching, learning, and preparing to rewrite the equation entirely. Once the war game ended, its revised outcome took on a life of its own. What had begun as an exercise became a reference point, and what had been adjusted quietly now stood as operational truth. The corrected results were circulated, briefed, and absorbed, stripped of their earlier ambiguities. In official memory, the game had confirmed what leadership already believed, that the path ahead was difficult, but fundamentally secure. Admirals began shaping plans with that assurance already embedded. Briefings were delivered not as proposals, but as confirmations. The tone was calm, confident, and decisive. There was no sense of contingency, no language of uncertainty. Emotionally, the leadership had already committed to success. The future was no longer a hypothesis, it was an expectation. The coming operation was framed as inevitable. Risk was acknowledged only in passing, treated as a technical detail rather than a defining feature. The possibility of failure was not debated, because it had already been ruled out by the logic of the exercise. The war game had spoken. The numbers were clean. The conclusions felt final. In this environment, doubt underwent a subtle transformation. Questions that might once have been considered prudent were now reinterpreted as obstacles. Skepticism became friction. Hesitation suggested a lack of faith, not only in the plan, but in the institution itself. To challenge assumptions was to challenge authority, and authority had already decided. As a result, assumptions hardened into directives. What had been theoretical expectations became concrete orders. Enemy behavior was no longer estimated, it was prescribed. Timelines were treated as certainties. Reactions were anticipated with confidence that bordered on inevitability. The plan no longer described what might happen, it described what would. Orders once issued generated momentum. Ships were assigned, schedules were fixed, resources were allocated along lines that reflected belief more than flexibility. With each step forward, reversal became less imaginable. The sheer weight of preparation began to drive decision-making, independent of evolving information. Gradually, momentum replaced strategy. The question shifted from whether the plan was sound to how efficiently it could be executed. Adjustments became cosmetic. Alternatives faded from discussion. The machinery of action was now in motion, and stopping it would have required confronting the very assumptions that had set it in motion. What had started as confidence solidified into doctrine. And doctrine, once established, proved resistant to evidence, warning, or chance. The future, it seemed, had already been decided. But beneath that certainty lay a fragile truth. Belief, when mistaken for reality, can turn movement itself into a trap, one that only reveals its shape when escape is no longer possible. Midway Atoll entered Japanese planning not as a place to be fought over, but as a lure. A small ring of coral and runways in the Central Pacific, it was valued less for its defenses than for its symbolism. Striking it, planners believed, would force the United States Navy to respond. The atoll was not conceived as a battlefield in its own right, but as bait something to draw the American carriers forward into a decisive confrontation on Japanese terms. That assumption shaped everything that followed. American commanders were expected to rush westward, compelled by pride, obligation, and habit. Their movements were treated as predictable reactions, rather than deliberate choices. The possibility that they might wait, probe, or maneuver independently was considered unlikely. In the logic of the plan, the enemy would arrive exactly when and where required. To reinforce this expectation, Japanese forces were spread across an enormous area. Multiple task groups advanced on parallel tracks, intended to demonstrate reach and control over the Pacific. It was an impressive display of coordination, but it came at a cost. Distance replaced concentration. The fleet was organized to impress doctrine rather than to absorb shock. As the plan grew more intricate, complexity began to stand in for strength. Timetables overlapped. Roles were narrowly defined. Each unit had a precise function and little margin beyond it. What appeared on paper as elegant design concealed a deeper vulnerability. When one element failed, others would have no space to compensate. Redundancy, long understood as a safeguard against uncertainty, was deliberately minimized. The plan relied on everything working as expected: scouting reports arriving on time, aircraft cycling smoothly, enemy reactions conforming to prediction. Flexibility was sacrificed for efficiency. Confidence filled the gap. Underlying it all was the belief that surprise still belonged to Japan. Pearl Harbor had taught them its power, and the war game had confirmed their advantage. The enemy, they believed, remained disoriented and reactive. The initiative was assumed to be secure, almost permanent. So the fleet prepared to sail with a sense of quiet assurance. Orders were issued. Routes were set. Crews drilled with disciplined precision. There was little sense of urgency, because there seemed little reason for it. The decisive battle was not a question of if, but when. After all, the dice had already been rolled once and adjusted to victory. In that light, doubt felt unnecessary. What the planners did not fully grasp was how fragile a plan becomes when it depends on an enemy behaving exactly as expected, and how unforgiving the sea can be when that expectation is wrong. As preparations accelerated, the briefing rooms of the fleet filled with charts, schedules, and carefully rehearsed presentations. To an outside observer, the process appeared thorough, even exhaustive. Yet within those orderly spaces, small uncertainties began to surface, noticed first by junior officers tasked with details rather than doctrine. They saw gaps in reconnaissance coverage that seemed difficult to reconcile. Search arcs left blind spots. Timelines for scout aircraft assumed ideal weather and flawless execution. Reports from distant sectors would arrive late, or not at all. Yet the plan left little room for delay. These observations were raised quietly, often framed as technical clarifications rather than concerns. When voiced, they met polite acknowledgement. The rooms did not grow tense, they grew still. Senior officers listened, nodded, and moved on. The questions were not answered so much as absorbed and neutralized. After a few repetitions, the message became clear. Precision was welcome. Doubt was not. The command culture prized obedience as a form of professionalism. Harmony in planning was treated as evidence of strength. Friction, even when intellectual, was seen as inefficiency. To challenge assumptions was to slow momentum, and momentum had already become a virtue in itself. In this atmosphere, the war game's original warnings faded from memory not through ignorance, but through choice. The uncomfortable results that had once appeared on the map table were no longer referenced. They had served their purpose, which was now complete. What remained was the corrected version, clean and reassuring. Confidence, over time, took on a ritual quality. Briefings followed familiar rhythms. Language became standardized. Outcomes were spoken of as milestones rather than possibilities. Repetition replaced examination. The plan was no longer an argument, it was a script. Officers memorized their roles with care. Tasks were learned precisely, boundaries clearly defined. Questions that might disrupt the flow were set aside. Each man understood his place within the larger design and took pride in executing it without deviation. As the fleet prepared to depart, discipline was flawless. Signals were crisp, movements were synchronized. From the outside, it appeared as the embodiment of naval professionalism. The machinery of war was functioning exactly as intended. What no one could hear in those silent rooms was the absence of dissent, and how that silence, once carried to sea, would shape the moment when reality finally refused to follow the script. In Hawaii, far from the map tables and briefing rooms of the Japanese fleet, another kind of war unfolded in silence. There were no ships here, no formations cutting through water. Instead, intelligence officers worked with fragments, intercepted transmissions, partial phrases, repeated symbols. What they studied was not movement, but language. And language, unlike ships, had habits. Within the intelligence units of the United States Navy, analysts began to notice patterns the Japanese war game had never considered. Messages repeated themselves in structure, if not in content. Certain phrases clustered around operations. Others appeared only before major movements. These were not answers, but they were clues, and the Americans treated them as such. Where Japanese planners sought certainty, American codebreakers accepted ambiguity as a working condition. They did not force conclusions to fit expectations. Instead, they tested possibilities, discarding those that failed and refining those that held. Uncertainty was not corrected, it was explored. Slowly, the enemy's confidence revealed itself as a liability. Japanese communications assumed security, not scrutiny. Messages were sent with the expectation that intent remained hidden. But certainty breeds patterns, and patterns invite recognition. Each intercepted signal narrowed the range of possibilities. One designation appeared repeatedly, AF. Its meaning was unclear, but its importance was not. Analysts suspected it referred to a specific objective, possibly Midway. Rather than assume, they devised a test. A false message was transmitted from Midway, reporting a critical shortage of fresh water. It was a small detail, mundane, almost trivial. Days later, Japanese communications confirmed it. AF is short on water. The codebreakers had their answer. The ambiguity collapsed into clarity, not through force, but through patience. What the war game had dismissed as unknowable had quietly become known. Knowledge accumulated without ceremony. There were no speeches, no declarations of certainty. Information was layered carefully, cross-checked and debated. Timelines were adjusted, probabilities recalculated. The picture that emerged was incomplete, but it was alive, constantly refined as new fragments arrived. Most importantly, American commanders were not given a script. They were given insight. The intelligence did not promise victory. It offered opportunity. Where the enemy expected reaction, the Americans prepared initiative. Plans were shaped around flexibility rather than prediction. Carriers were positioned not where doctrine demanded, but where intelligence suggested. The ocean, vast and concealing, became an ally rather than an obstacle. By the time Japanese forces moved toward Midway, convinced they controlled the tempo, another fleet was already in motion, silent, informed, and deliberately misplaced. The Americans were preparing to be exactly where they were not expected. And in that invisible advantage, built from fragments of language and tolerated uncertainty, the balance of the coming battle had already begun to shift. Technology alone does not decide wars, but it changes what is possible. By mid-1942, American forces were beginning to integrate tools that extended perception beyond the limits of human senses. Radar, still imperfect and often mistrusted, allowed ships to detect movement beyond the horizon and through darkness and cloud. It did not offer certainty, but it offered warning, and warning, even when incomplete, reshaped decision-making. Aircraft carriers, once viewed primarily as mobile airfields, began to function as thinking platforms. Information flowed inward from scouts, radar screens, and radio intercepts, then outward again as revised orders. The carrier was no longer just a place where planes took off and landed. It became a nerve center where interpretation mattered as much as execution. Decisions were made continuously, not deferred to prearranged timelines. This shift was reinforced by command philosophy. American commanders were given latitude rather than scripts. Objectives were defined, but methods were left open. Subordinates were trusted to adjust based on conditions they could see and feel. Authority did not vanish, but it became responsive instead of rigid. Improvisation, once treated as a symptom of poor planning, was institutionalized. Pilots altered routes mid-mission. Controllers adjusted launch schedules as reports changed. Commanders revised assumptions in real time. The system did not pretend to eliminate error. It assumed error was inevitable and built mechanisms to absorb it. When mistakes occurred, and they did, they were corrected quickly rather than concealed. A missed contact prompted wider searches, not blame. A failed attack led to immediate reassessment, not rigid adherence to plan. Learning happened during action, not after it. The battlefield became a classroom, unforgiving but instructive. Training reflected this philosophy. Crews were drilled not just to perform perfectly, but to recover from failure. Damaged aircraft were salvaged. Disrupted formations were regrouped. Confusion was treated as a condition to manage, not a flaw to deny. Resilience replaced elegance as the quiet measure of competence. Across the Pacific, a contrast was forming. One side relied on plans refined until flawless on paper. The other relied on processes designed to evolve under pressure. One sought to eliminate uncertainty. The other learned to live inside it. As these approaches moved toward collision, the environment itself began to take sides. The sea favored those who could respond fastest to the unexpected. The sky rewarded those who adjusted mid-flight. The advantage no longer belonged to the side with the cleanest plan, but to the one that could change it. And with each intercepted signal, each recalculated bearing, and each improvised decision, the battlefield quietly shifted toward those who adapted fastest, whether their opponent believed it possible or not. By early June 1942, two fleets moved across the Pacific, guided by fundamentally different beliefs about how war should be understood. For Japan, the plan remained the anchor. It had been refined, rehearsed, and emotionally accepted. The war game had confirmed it after correction. Doctrine supported it. Discipline enforced it. The future, as conceived in briefing rooms, was something to be executed. Across the ocean, the American approach looked less orderly, but it was deliberately so. There was a plan, but it was provisional. What mattered more was the process, how information was gathered, tested, and acted upon. Intelligence was not treated as confirmation, but as a stream. Decisions were expected to change as that stream shifted. The difference revealed itself in what each side sought. Japanese commanders looked for reassurance that events were unfolding as expected. Reports were measured against assumptions already held. When information aligned, it strengthened confidence. When it did not, it was delayed, questioned, or deprioritized. The plan was the standard by which reality was judged. American commanders, by contrast, sought information that challenged them. Ambiguity was not a flaw to be corrected, but a signal to look closer. Conflicting reports prompted wider searches. Gaps triggered new questions. Doubt was not hidden, it was used openly as a tool for refinement. This contrast shaped behavior at every level. On one side, uncertainty was managed through silence. On the other, it was managed through discussion. Japanese officers were expected to project confidence downward. American officers were expected to surface problems upward. Neither system was without risk, but only one assumed that error was inevitable. As the fleets drew closer, the war game's assumptions began to unravel quietly. The enemy had not reacted on schedule. Expected movements failed to appear. Reconnaissance reports arrived late or incomplete. None of this yet suggested disaster. Each discrepancy could be explained in isolation, but taken together, they hinted that the model was failing. Still, the plan held. Adjustments were minor. The structure remained intact. Momentum carried the operation forward, reinforced by the belief that surprise was still secure and initiative uncontested. The absence of visible resistance was taken as confirmation rather than warning. Meanwhile, American forces were repositioning with deliberate uncertainty. Carriers moved into locations chosen not by doctrine but by inference. Timelines were shortened, launch windows tightened. Nothing about the coming engagement felt inevitable except that it would happen soon. Fate, indifferent to belief, began to narrow. The vastness of the Pacific compressed into search arcs and fuel ranges. Hours became more important than days. Small decisions: when to launch, where to look, whom to trust, began to outweigh months of preparation. Neither side yet knew the full shape of the moment approaching. But one trusted that the plan would hold. The other trusted that when it did not, adaptation would matter more than elegance. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the two philosophies moved toward collision. The dice, adjusted once in a quiet room, waited to be rolled again, this time without correction and without appeal. The 4th of June, 1942, began not with clarity, but with uncertainty. Both fleets entered the morning believing they were close to decision, yet unsure of the other's exact position. Over the Pacific, the sky was calm, the sea deceptively empty. What followed would unfold not according to plan, but according to timing measured in minutes rather than intentions measured in months. Japanese aircraft launched before dawn toward Midway, carrying out the opening strike as designed. The attack inflicted damage, but it did not silence the airfield. As pilots turned back toward their carriers, they reported resistance still intact. The message forced a choice whether to prepare a second strike on the island or hold aircraft ready for the anticipated appearance of American carriers. Doctrine hesitated where certainty had once ruled. As the returning planes approached the fleet, they were low on fuel and ammunition. Combat had consumed what margins they carried. Landings could not be delayed. Deck crews rushed to recover aircraft, refuel them, rearm them. Bombs were moved. Torpedoes were shifted. Hangar decks filled with fueled planes, weapons exposed, hoses stretched across steel floors. The carriers became crowded, vulnerable spaces. Above it all, reconnaissance lagged. Search planes launched late. Some failed to reach assigned sectors. Others reported contact without clarity. A sighting here, a delay there. Information arrived fragmented, stripped of urgency by distance and assumption. Each report required interpretation. Each interpretation consumed time. When confirmation finally came that American carriers were present, it arrived too late to simplify the moment. The decks were mid-transition, neither ready to strike nor ready to defend. Orders were revised again. Bombs were swapped. Torpedoes were brought back. The choreography of the plan unraveled under the weight of its own precision. Then, from altitude, the Americans arrived. Dive bombers appeared almost by accident, emerging from cloud and glare where none were expected. They had searched, missed, and searched again, guided less by plan than by instinct and chance. Now, they found the fleet at its most exposed, decks crowded, defenses disorganized, attention divided. What followed lasted only minutes. Bombs fell in steep arcs, punching through flight decks and detonating among fueled aircraft. Fire spread instantly, fed by aviation, gasoline, and unsecured ordnance. Explosions cascaded through hangars designed for efficiency, not containment. Control vanished as heat and smoke overwhelmed crews trained for precision, not catastrophe. Months of preparation collapsed into moments of chaos. Commands could not travel faster than flame. Damage control parties fought fires that refused to yield. Aircraft meant for attack became liabilities. Steel warped. Smoke blinded. The carriers that had once symbolized dominance became infernos adrift on calm water. From the air, American pilots struggled to comprehend the scale of what they were witnessing. From the decks below, Japanese sailors fought to save ships already slipping beyond control. There was no grand maneuver left, no doctrinal response that fit the moment. Only reaction remained. In those few minutes, the balance of the Pacific War shifted. The elegant logic of the plan was erased by coincidence, timing, and exposure. Surprise assumed, lost, returned without warning, wielded by an enemy who had waited, learned, and arrived unseen. Fire rewrote the equation where certainty once stood, and as smoke climbed into the clear morning sky, it carried with it the first undeniable proof that the future imagined in the war game had been fatally wrong. Within hours, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. 4 Japanese carriers, once the core of naval air power in the Pacific, burned or lay fatally wounded. Fires raged beyond control, fed by fuel, bombs, and the architecture of ships designed for speed and efficiency rather than survival under bombardment. The sea around them filled with debris, oil, and men. What had taken years to build was being erased in an afternoon. The loss extended far beyond steel and tonnage. Veteran air crews, the most experienced pilots and deck teams Japan possessed, were consumed with their ships. These men represented a reservoir of skill that could not be replaced quickly. if at all. Training pipelines could produce aircraft, but not judgment forged through combat. With them went institutional memory lessons learned through hard experience that no manual could reproduce. As the magnitude of the losses spread through the fleet, certainty collapsed. Orders slowed, then stopped. Reports contradicted one another. Commanders struggled to understand what had happened, let alone respond to it. The confidence that had once driven rapid decision-making now gave way to hesitation. Command paralysis replaced command certainty. In the smoke and wreckage, the war game's earlier warnings reappeared not as abstract figures, but as physical reality. The outcomes, once adjusted away, now unfolded precisely as they had first appeared on paper. Carrier concentrations proved vulnerable. Assumptions about enemy timing failed. Surprise arrived from an unexpected direction. The future that had been edited out returned without compromise. Individual acts of courage and tactical skill did not vanish. Crews fought fires with discipline. Pilots attempted counterattacks under impossible conditions. Damage control parties worked until heat and smoke made further effort meaningless. But tactical brilliance, however admirable, could not compensate for strategic blindness. No amount of heroism could reverse a decision already made months earlier in a quiet room. Victory, once treated as inevitable, evaporated with stunning speed. The momentum that had carried the fleet forward now carried it backward, toward retreat and reassessment. What had seemed like temporary disruption revealed itself as permanent loss. The balance of power shifted not gradually, but decisively. As surviving ships withdrew, the psychological shock settled in. The belief in control, so carefully maintained, had been shattered. The war was no longer unfolding according to expectation. The enemy had not behaved as predicted. The plan had not absorbed surprise. The dice, long assumed friendly, had shown their true nature. In retrospect, the pattern was unmistakable. The outcome had been visible once briefly, inconveniently, before it was corrected. That correction had offered comfort, not accuracy. It preserved confidence at the cost of understanding, and when reality finally asserted itself, it did so without mercy. The dice fell exactly as they had first warned, not because fate was cruel, but because chance had been denied its voice. What burned on the ocean's surface was not only a fleet, but the illusion that certainty could be engineered simply by refusing to accept uncertainty. In the days that followed, survivors searched for explanations amid wreckage and smoke. Officers replayed sequences of events in their minds, tracing decisions back through briefings, assumptions, and unchallenged conclusions. Many of those choices had once seemed self-evident. Now they demanded scrutiny. What emerged was not a single mistake, but a chain of decisions never seriously questioned when questioning still mattered. The plan, once admired for its elegance, revealed a fatal flaw. It contained no margin for surprise. Every phase depended on the previous one, unfolding precisely as expected. Timelines overlapped without slack. Roles were fixed without redundancy. When reality deviated even slightly, the structure offered no space to recover. What had been designed for efficiency proved brittle under stress. Doctrine, long treated as a shield against uncertainty, fractured when exposed to it. The principles that had guided planning assumed a compliant environment, not a reactive enemy. They favored control over curiosity, certainty over adjustment. Under pressure, those principles provided no guidance for improvisation. They described what should have happened, not what was happening. Across the battlefield, a different pattern became visible. The enemy did not behave as a static opponent, but as a learning organism. American forces adapted between engagements, altering tactics, refining coordination, and absorbing information rapidly. Errors became lessons. Losses informed change. Each encounter reshaped the next. This capacity for learning, once discounted, now stood at the center of the outcome. As reports accumulated, numbers lost their power to reassure. Ratios, projections, and past performance no longer protected belief. Industrial strength, pilot quality, and operational experience, all factors once minimized or abstracted, asserted themselves in concrete form. The enemy was no longer an equation. It was a system that improved under pressure. For Japan, the realization came too late to alter events already set in motion. The loss of carriers and air crews could not be reversed. Initiative, once surrendered, could not be reclaimed quickly. Strategic options narrowed with each passing week. What remained was adaptation under constraint. not choice. The future of the war shifted direction with finality. The offensive momentum that had defined the opening months faded, replaced by containment and defense. The tempo slowed, but the imbalance grew. Time, once assumed neutral or favorable, now favored the side that could learn fastest and produce most efficiently. In this new phase of the Pacific War, understanding replaced confidence, but only after confidence had already exacted its price. The lessons were clear, even if they were learned too late. War did not reward certainty. It rewarded those willing to revise their beliefs under fire. And as the surviving commanders looked ahead, they faced a future no longer shaped by plans made in quiet rooms, but by realities forged in open water where the cost of ignoring uncertainty had already been paid in full. In retrospect, the war game conducted before Midway was never a tool for prediction. It did not fail because it miscalculated the future. It failed because its purpose was misunderstood. War games do not forecast events. They reveal the assumptions of those who design them. They expose how an institution thinks under controlled conditions, what it fears, what it trusts, and what it refuses to confront. The initial results of the exercise had not been wrong. They had been inconvenient. When those results challenged belief, they were not examined more deeply. They were corrected. In doing so, leaders altered their understanding of risk without altering the risk itself. Reality remained unchanged. Only perception shifted, and perception proved easier to manage than consequence. This process revealed the quiet power of hierarchy. Within rigid command structures, truth often moves slowly upward, if at all. Uncomfortable findings are softened as they pass through layers of authority. By the time they reach decision-makers, their urgency has been drained away. In this way, hierarchies can silence warning faster than any enemy action. Midway demonstrated the cost of that silence. Precision in planning, once prized as a mark of professionalism, became a liability when it left no room for adjustment. The Japanese plan had been exact, elegant, and brittle. When confronted with uncertainty, it could not bend without breaking. The American approach, less orderly on paper, proved more lethal in practice because it allowed adaptation. Adaptability, not perfection, emerged as the decisive factor. American forces absorbed information, revised assumptions, and acted under conditions of incomplete knowledge. They accepted uncertainty as permanent rather than temporary. This did not eliminate risk, but it prevented surprise from becoming fatal. In that light, the dice used in the war game take on new meaning. They were not the source of error. Chance itself was not the enemy. The problem lay in the refusal to accept what chance revealed. By re-rolling outcomes until they aligned with expectation, planners removed the very signal that the exercise had been designed to provide. History confirmed what honesty had first suggested. The outcomes suppressed in the planning room appeared unaltered on the open sea. The war game had spoken once, clearly, before being edited into comfort. Its original warning returned not as theory, but as fire, smoke, and irreversible loss. The lesson extends beyond Midway. Institutions that prize certainty over inquiry do not eliminate uncertainty. They merely postpone encountering it. When it arrives, it does so without compromise. War, like reality itself, cannot be persuaded by confidence alone. The true revelation of the war game was not that Japan would lose a battle. It was that the path to that loss was visible long before the first aircraft launched, if only the outcome had been allowed to stand. And in that refusal to listen, history found its verdict. Long after the smoke over Midway cleared, the battle took on a second life, not in after-action reports alone, but in classrooms, staff colleges, and quiet studies of command failure. It became a case study examined by generations who never saw the Pacific, taught not for its tactics alone, but for what it revealed about the human mind under pressure. The lesson was never simply about carriers or aircraft or timing. Those details mattered, but they were not the core. Midway endured because it exposed psychology, how belief shapes perception, how institutions protect confidence, and how certainty can become more dangerous than ignorance. It showed that defeat often begins not on the battlefield, but in the refusal to accept uncomfortable information. Planning, the case demonstrated, is indispensable. War without preparation is chaos, but planning alone is insufficient. Plans are built on assumptions, and assumptions demand humility. Without it, preparation becomes performance, an exercise in confirming what leaders already wish to believe. Certainty, Midway taught, is emotionally comforting. It quiets doubt, simplifies decisions, and preserves cohesion. But comfort is not accuracy. The future does not reward confidence simply because it is confidently held. War remains indifferent to belief, hierarchy, and intention. It responds only to action and consequence. What doomed the Japanese plan was not incompetence or lack of courage. It was the decision to edit reality. The war game had offered a warning brief, inconvenient and easy to dismiss. By altering its outcome, planners removed the very signal designed to protect them. They replaced uncertainty with reassurance, and in doing so, blinded themselves to risk. War punishes such edits without emotion. It does not negotiate with confidence. It does not respect hierarchy. It does not pause to allow beliefs to adjust. When reality arrives, it does so fully formed, indifferent to how carefully doubt was suppressed. The ashes of Midway carried that message forward. They marked the point where elegance failed and adaptability prevailed, where precision collapsed and learning endured, where certainty met its limit. In the end, the war game had not been wrong. It had spoken once, honestly, before being corrected into silence. Its original outcome was not prophecy, it was possibility. A possibility denied, and therefore realized. They fixed the dice to win, and lost exactly as the war game warned.